and hopefully we will have some more folk joining us. In fact, Jerry, if you don't mind, I'm going to make you co-host as well. If you wouldn't mind admitting people, since I do a poor job of multitasking, we'll keep the audience coming while I give a brief intro. I've been asked by our guest speakers to say a little bit about what this is all about, and I realize we might have some new folk here. So while I normally do the what the heck is from resilience to restoration at the end of every public boom, I'm moving it up front. So here's a brief overview of who we are and why we're here tonight. I'm Kyle Kreider. I'm the Program and Policy Director for two organizations. As you might be able to see behind me, I'm with the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Why two organizations? Well, here in Alabama, ALIPL, as we say, Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, is both a chapter of national IPL that hopefully y'all are already familiar with, as well as a program of People's Justice Council. People's Justice Council was founded 4 years ago now by Rev. Michael Malcolm, a environmental justice hero, and he cannot be here tonight because he is out on the road fighting the good fight. But we are definitely all walking in his shadow with this organization. Both Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council operate at the intersection of climate, energy, and social/environmental justice. And love to tell you more about the organizations, but we've only got an hour, and so let me tell you about the most relevant initiative that we are all working on, this thing called From Resilience to Restoration. I'm glad to see we have some of our Gulf State partners on this call who can tell you even better than I can, honestly. From Resilience to Restoration is our PJC's first federal grant. We received $300,000 from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. NASEM is the acronym, or just National Academies. Do this thing called From Resilience to Restoration. What the heck is that? Well, like the wise old coach says, you cannot play a purely defensive game. That's why we're trying to shift the focus from resilience, the work that we're all doing, to restoration. What do we mean by restoration? Well, for purposes of our grant, we're categorizing it with what we call the 3E. There's ecological restoration that y'all probably all know about. It's planting and protective mangroves on the coast, protecting wetlands, protecting green spaces, waterways. It's the ecological restoration to make sure that nature can continue to provide the free services that keep us all alive, and that any human economies are based on. So first E is economic restoration. I'm sorry, ecological restoration. Second E is economic restoration. Now, we deal with frontline communities primarily, and when we're talking economic restoration in a frontline community, it's a bit of a misnomer, because there's no restoration for what these frontline communities have been through historically. We need to elevate frontline community, keep local dollars local. Just to give you one example, since this is kind of a nebulous area, economics is probably not any of our strong suits here. We are big fans of the formation of local worker-owned cooperatives, for example. We see cooperatives as a way of the dangers of profiteering under capitalism and for-profit model, and a great way to keep power in the hands of local folk, dollars local in the community. And then last but not least, our third E, and honestly, we were astounded that National Academies loved our approach. The third E is ecumenical. We, both ALIPL and PJC, are interfaith organization. And they loved our emphasis on houses of faith in frontline communities to lead this resilience to restoration work. As I hope y'all know, houses of faith already provide the role of resilient centers in frontline community. Whenever there's a weather-related natural disaster, where does the help come from? Where is it often based? The local church, the local house of faith, synagogue, mosque. And so, we are very much about championing local houses of faith as restoration centers. And the ecumenical part comes in because we realize that there's a lot of toxic theology. We're in the South, we're in the Bible Belt. There's a lot of toxic theology that has gone into creating the problems, leading us to where we are now, and we've got to combat that. We call restoration theology and interfaith restoration theology. So that's us and our program from resilience to restoration in a nutshell. We're here tonight with our wonderful guest speakers. And I should add that this grant is a Gulf State oriented grant. And I hope we have time tonight to hear from folks like our wonderful Florida partner in this process, Jan Boer with Unitarian Universalist Justice Florida, UUJ Florida. And Jan can tell you about some marvelous examples of this work in Florida. But our speakers tonight, I'd like to introduce Brian and Kristen with NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. The weather folks, but not just weather. They're here to talk about climate and resilience and restoration, and this concept of equity in government program. We are missing another speaker that we had hoped could be here tonight to join Brian and Kristen. Montravias King, that heads up the Justice 40 Accelerator program. I might add that People's Justice Council was a member of America's first Justice 40 Accelerator cohort. Well, Montravias is now heading up that program. He could not be here tonight. He's had some work stuff pressed on him at the last minute, but he does hope to join us soon. So look forward to introducing Montravias at a future meeting. But tonight, let me tell you about Brian and Kristen. And y'all please correct me if I am massacring your names in any way. Brian LaMarre. Is it LaMarre or LaMarre?
No, that's the first time I think most people have ever pronounced it correct the first time. So
wonderful. Brian LaMarre is the NOAA Gulf of Mexico Regional Collaboration Team Lead. And again, there's an emphasis on the Gulf Coast because this is a Gulf state-oriented grant. He is also meteorologist-in-charge for the National Weather Service in Tampa, Florida. Brian grew up in Connecticut and started his NOAA career in 1992 as a student volunteer with the National Weather Service, NWS, the office in Hartford, and has worked in a number of field operational meteorologist and field manager positions at NWS offices across the country since then, including his role as the National Marine and Coastal Weather Services Program Manager at NWS headquarters. Since 2007, Brian has been the meteorologist in charge of NWS Weather Forecast Office in Tampa, Florida, where he leads the office in the provision of weather, water, and climate forecasts, warnings, and decision services for the public, media and emergency management partners across West Central and Southwest Florida. Brian has been the NOAA Gulf of Mexico Regional Collaboration Team Lead 2015. Welcome, Brian. Also, we have Kristen Laursen, NOAA Gulf of Mexico Regional Coordinator. Kristen Laursen is NOAA's Gulf of Mexico Regional Coordinator, building understanding and productive connections between the different parts of NOAA and with partners in the Gulf region, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. And yes, that's where our from resilience to restoration partners are. NOAA's Gulf-based regional collaboration efforts focus on internal and external communication opportunities, building and leveraging sustainable partnerships, and encouraging inclusive, intentional engagement with communities, students, other agents. So, yeah, Brian and Kristen are here to tell us about not just resilience and restoration work, but specifically about equity as equity and government program. So let me turn it over to Brian and Kristen now. Thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle, and definitely appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. This is actually a treat, and I got home from work about an hour ago with the National Weather Service office, and here I am at home, and this is great to be able to connect with you. And definitely wanted to, since you said we have a little more time, wanted to kind of give a little overview. We can go to the next slide, just as I'll talk about some certain items here. You mentioned that the Weather Service, we focus on weather and climate and water impacts. Something that I wanted to make sure everyone knew. The National Weather Service, we're part of NOAA, so NOAA has several line offices or several other organizations, if you will, within itself, and we focus on weather, we focus on oceans, we focus on fisheries, we focus on satellite data, we focus on atmospheric research, and these are all the different what we call line offices that make up NOAA, and we work together. And a lot of there's overlap with a lot of that. The weather and climate, we use satellite data, we use ocean data. That information enables decisions for fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico, and also enables decisions for people, communities that live along the Gulf Coast and farther inland with Texas and Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. But the Gulf of Mexico region is a highly volatile and active weather and climate area. I'm sure we all know since we live in this area. You can see last year, this is just the number of disasters, weather and climate, that have impacted the United States. And there were 18 different events, each of which produced at least $1 billion in economic impact. And say, for example, you can see the hurricane symbols on the bottom right. That's just where those hurricanes made landfall last year. If we were to go back 2021, 2020, they were more Florida and also Texas, and a significant amount over Louisiana. But you can see Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Fiona, Hurricane Nicole, definitely a lot of impacts. And Hurricane Ian impacted my area of responsibility. I cover much of the west coast of Florida and central Florida. And, last September 28th, Hurricane Ian made landfall. And as of right now, we're up to about $113 billion in damages. So all of these events, pretty significant. You can see Texas with the hailstorms, which even recently, the past couple of weeks, has been very atypical for severe weather for the month of June across this area. This is typical for, March, April, but for the month of June, we don't usually see this type of severe weather for hailstorms and tornadoes. I used to work in Lubbock, Texas, so far west Texas, and just last night, about an hour, it was 8 p.m. Central time when a tornado went through a town known as Matador, just northeast of Lubbock. It's on national news as I look at my screen, but a lot of impacts there where people lost their life in that area. But this is what we focus on. We talk about resiliency. We talk about reaching out to underserved communities. This is what NOAA does. This is why we have the people in the communities. So the National Weather Service, we have 122 offices just like mine that cover every square inch of soil across the United States and its territories. And so we're immersed in the communities. We're working hand in hand with faith-based organizations, with emergency management, with media, with schools, with other parts of NOAA to make sure that they not only receive the information that we provide, but also we try to help them understand it. And on the next slide, we'll look at, as I mentioned, the impacts across the Gulf of Mexico. This time of year, June 1st to November 30th, it's the climatological or the average time of year where we call hurricane season. But we've had tropical storms and hurricanes outside of that period. We've seen them form in April. We've seen them form in May. And, back in 2005, you likely remember that year, the year of Hurricane Katrina and Rita and Wilma. That year, we had a record-breaking year. And we had a hurricane that formed in December, and it lasted until through January of 2006. So The climate is warming. There tends to be debate on that. I'll tell you now, the facts are it's warming. The debate can be, who's responsible, but I think we need to go with the facts, and the climate is changing and the weather is changing along with it. And for example, today we have a tropical storm out there known as Brett, and it formed off the coast of Africa. We don't see that in the month of June. That's not typical. That's usually like a September timeframe, and the waters in the central and eastern Atlantic are well above normal. It's record levels. And so that portion of the Atlantic thinks it's September, and the atmosphere goes along with it and creates tropical storms. So what we're looking at here again is a highly vulnerable part of the United States. And on the next slide, we'll be looking at, when we talk about the loss of life, I wish every hurricane and weather and climate event could have zero impacts, but we know that's not realistic. And I believe that we can reduce the loss of life and we can reduce the impacts from these storms. But it definitely involves what you talked about, Kyle, earlier. It's about being resilient. It's about being aware. It's about embracing information, scientific information, and helping people make decisions, because not everyone has the scientific mind. Not everyone receives information or digests information the same. So it's very important for the diversity and inclusivity to be involved in that education process, so we reach as many people as possible. And you can see the spikes on this graph here, the states of Texas and North Carolina and Florida, mainly because we have the most expansive coastlines, geographically. So they're more vulnerable to impacts from tropical storms and hurricanes. And just the size of the states across the Gulf region are huge. And so the people living along the coastline or far inland are very vulnerable for climate impacts. And on the next slide, we'll be looking at, we talk about vulnerable communities, vulnerable populations. We talk about the elderly, and they're among the segment of the population that are most heavily hit, by the impacts of whatever weather or climate or water event. And this, you can see on the right-hand side, we're talking about impacts that could be, flooding, freshwater flooding, that's more inland, versus storm surge, which can be, saltwater flooding, and you have lightning and rip currents and tornadoes. We're going to talk about heat eventually, and I'm glad you sent the information that you did about, the efforts for heat resiliency. Heat is not on this slide, but because we're talking mainly about hurricanes on this slide, but heat is the number one killer, the number one weather and climate related killer in the United States. Heat typically claims more lives every single year than hurricanes, lightning, and tornadoes combined. So again, significant, and Kristen and I are going to talk about that coming up soon. On the next slide, when we look at hurricanes and the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, the whole United States, you can see historically the loss of life. And we know the science has been improving, technology has been improving, the warning system has been improving, and people are starting to take seriously the impacts of storms. And you can go back to the worst natural disaster to hit the United States was a hurricane. So again, 1900, the Galveston storm. Look at the number of fatalities. It's unimaginable today. You're looking at 6,000 to 12,000 people. That's almost on the order of some global wars. And a hurricane did this in Galveston. And looking down as we go into some more recent dates, it's still a horrendous problem because a lot of people are moving towards the coastline. They are moving into areas that may not be as resilient as they should be. As I mentioned, climate change, that's adding to sea level rise. So that's adding to more water that can impact people with storm surge. So what may have been a 4-foot storm surge, maybe 6 foot, and that may mean life or death for some people. And you can see, again, the recent ones, Hurricane Ian, 2022, the number of people that lost their lives. And you obviously remember a lot of these storms on this list. And on the next slide, I wanted to make sure that everyone on the call knew of this resource. Now, a lot of TV stations, a lot of cities and counties will have their own apps, okay? How to get alerted for severe weather in your area. The National Weather Service does not have an app for ourselves, so we worked with FEMA to develop one. And because there's a public-private partnership agreement that the Weather Service can't create its own app if it's in direct conflict with the private sector who could benefit from it by charging and having monetary gain. So we worked with FEMA, who was able to do it. And you can go on to wherever you get your apps, you know, it's free. So just search for FEMA weather app and it'll look like what's on the screen here. I have it on my phone right here, along with others. And you can program counties and cities and you can be alerted when the National Weather Service office near you, and there's one close to you, and when they issue warnings, you'll be able to get them. And on the next slide, we'll kind of switch gears a little bit and kind of talk about, you know, the climate equity pilot projects that have been going on across the country. And I kind of gave you a background on NOAA and the line offices that are within NOAA, how big the National Weather Service is. Well, Kristen and I, as you read our bios, Kyle, we're part of the NOAA Gulf of Mexico Regional Collaboration Team, and Grace Gray is with us, and Alyssa is with us, and they work with us on that team. There's actually 8 regional teams across NOAA, just like the Gulf of Mexico. And those are the dividing lines that you see across the country. You have the Gulf of Mexico, the Southeast, the North Atlantic, the Great Lakes, our Central region, Western region, Alaska, and Pacific. So each of which is very targeted and very focused on the geographic needs of that area, if that makes sense. And obviously in the Gulf of Mexico, we have a whole suite of hazards, whether it be climate, weather, water, hurricanes, it could be drought, it could be heat, it could be cold weather, it could be tornadoes. Again, everything, unfortunately, impacts the Gulf of Mexico. And what happened as over the past couple of years is each of us were kind of challenged to work more closely with underserved and vulnerable communities in the area. And we're going to talk about what we're doing in the Gulf of Mexico with a particular pilot project in Louisiana. And on the next slide, Kristen's going to focus on, you know, what we did, which was not long after a very powerful hurricane impacted the state of Louisiana, and who we connected with and where it has brought us today.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. Yeah, as Brian mentioned, all of the different regions had roundtables around the country in our particular parts of the world, focusing on issues that were challenges. And as Brian mentioned, the Gulf of Mexico has a bunch of different things that we deal with. And for ours, we wanted to focus on inundation and flooding in Louisiana. It's a big issue. It happened on October 6th of 2021. We actually had to reschedule it from August 31st because Hurricane Ida made landfall in Louisiana just days before we were planning to have this conversation. And, you know, obviously there were people that were impacted that were a part of our call, and we wanted to be respectful of that and make sure that they were able to take care of themselves and their communities first. Pretty broad topic. And similarly, we had a really nice suite of representation for the roundtable. First, we had a representative from the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe. They're in Southeast Louisiana, and they're a state recognized tribe. We'll talk more about that because our climate and equity pilot project focuses on working with them. We also had representation from Louisiana Sea Grant. Sea Grant is a program around the whole coastline, including the Great Lakes, and is really great at connecting with communities and sharing information, and also working with undergraduates and graduate students and, you know, research and a lot of applied research as well. We also had the State of Louisiana's Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, or GOSEP. They do a lot of the emergency response activities. So, you know, if there's a hurricane or a major flood, they're there, and they're trying to, you know, work with FEMA and the other agencies to coordinate that. Foundation for Louisiana, which is a nonprofit, was also there and able to talk about equity issues. The United Way was there. It was a really interesting presentation from Lake Charles. She focused a lot on the freeze impacts, as well as the series of hurricanes that happened, and just what they did in their community, and how how things went, because it was, hurricane, tropical storm, it was that, and then they got the freeze and they hadn't recovered from the hurricanes yet. And we also had Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. They're in charge of a lot of the ecological restoration work in South Louisiana. There's a lot of land loss going on in Louisiana, if you're not familiar, and they're trying to work on that. And also Louisiana State University, a kind of a laboratory that works with communities on, how they can be designed better and, be more friendly for the families there, as well as, reduce flooding impacts and things like that. So a lot of great conversations in this. Some of the things that we heard were the need for additional engagement with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe. So they were severely impacted by Hurricane Ida. We'll get into that in a minute. Also, support for work towards improving rapid intensification forecasts and modeling for tropical cyclones, which is the storms and the hurricanes and the depressions. Rapid intensification is when, and Brian, I might butcher this, I apologize up front, but rapid intensification is when the storm kind of goes from something that isn't terribly big or strong to something that is really quickly. And that seems to be happening for a lot of the storms recently. That are impacting the Gulf Coast are going from a tropical storm to a Category 4, for example, in the last couple of days before landfall, which is really challenging for being able to evacuate people, for example. We also heard about the need to collaborate with other federal partners to ensure that recovery efforts and resilience planning funds and other supports are consistently and proportionally and equitably applied across comparable events in between large and small communities. The large and small communities came up pretty often actually during the call. And that's part of how we ended up with our pilot project as well. Because, for example, on the news, you get a lot of attention to the New Orleanses of the world, but you don't necessarily get as much attention to Montague, Louisiana, or Lake Charles, Louisiana. So that was a bit of the point there. So out of this, we were to make a series of pilot projects, and similarly around the country, there are 7 pilot projects, actually. The Southeastern Caribbean and the Western regions are working together on theirs, and I'll chat about that a little bit as well later. So ours, as I mentioned, we're working on building relationships and community resilience with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe in Southeast Louisiana. I might also refer to them as the PASIT. That's just the acronym for the community. There's about 800, and so it's a small, relatively rural community. A lot of people are shrimp fishermen. And our primary partners, as I mentioned, are the tribe, as well as Louisiana Sea Grant. Louisiana Sea Grant, particularly Matt Bethel, has done a lot of work on traditional ecological knowledge and how to connect that with more Western type of science. So why are we doing this? As I've mentioned a little bit already, but coastal Louisiana shows the highest trends for relative sea level rise in the continental United States. Relative sea level rise is so there's global sea level rise, which is how much is it rising around the world. But relative sea level rise is what's it doing locally, what's it doing in that state, for example. And that changes depending on where you are in the world or in the country. For Alaska, for example, there might be places where the land is still coming up after the last ice age. And so they're actually, not having sea level rise. It might be going down in one place, but Louisiana, there are a lot of land subsidence or kind of land sinking type related issues. So it's rising pretty quickly there. As I mentioned, the PASIT was also really impacted by Hurricane Ida. They got basically a direct hit. It wasn't the only time they've been hit either. Since 2005, they've been affected by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita and Gustav and Ike, and they were also impacted by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So they've had to deal with a lot, and they've done some amazing work on how they can stay as a community and stay as they are and rebuild and continue with their culture. And, I can't speak for them, but we had a site visit. And just a couple of things that really impacted me are kind of shown in these pictures here. So the one on the left, it's a lot of salt marsh around their community. And those snags that you see standing up there are trees. Those are dead trees. And the area used to be forested, but with the salt water coming in, the trees died. And so they've lost a lot of land. They've lost forested areas. They used to be able to have large gardens. Some still raise cattle, but not as many as they used to. So they've seen a lot of changes. They've had to move their community a couple of different times. When we were out on the boat with Mr. Dardar, one of the elders, he was pointing out areas where there used to be their cemetery, and it's just a marsh now. So they've dealt with a whole lot. And on the shorter term scale, the picture on the right is a shrimp boat in the marsh, and it was blown there from actually quite a ways distant. It was not coming from that little water body in front of it. It was from a good ways away. And that picture was taken a little over a year after Hurricane Ida. And the person who owns the boat still goes out there and still protects the boat because he wants to get it back into the water and get back to shrimp fishing. And he protects it from people that would come and scavenge parts off of it, for example. So a little bit of more of the long-term effects in the left picture, and the short-term and more extreme event effects that they've been dealing with on the right. So for our pilot project, we have a number of different objectives. First, it's to build longer, stronger, lasting relationships with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe. NOAA is a broad federal agency with a lot of different areas, fisheries, coastal mapping, tides and currents, weather, also solar storms. They're up in Boulder. So how do you take a big federal agency that does a whole lot of different things and has information and products and services on a whole bunch of different things and make that information relevant for what a local community needs? So part of that is learning to build those stronger and lasting relationships with communities like the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe. Part of that is working jointly together to identify issues and challenges that the community is facing and where NOAA's products and services and information can be useful, and to take that information and tailor it to make it locally relevant to address their unique needs and challenges as they work to mitigate the impacts of climate change for their community and make their own decisions. We're also working to connect NOAA's resources with the pilot Tribal Coastal Resilience Index. I'll talk about that in a little bit. That's something that the tribe and Louisiana Sea Grant are working on together. And also, I've kind of already covered this a little bit, but we want to identify ways that NOAA can more effectively connect with and serve coastal, tribal, or small rural communities locally. Again, how do you take the breadth of NOAA and the petabytes and petabytes of data and visualization models and tools, and how do we do better at taking that and connecting it with smaller communities that need it and can use it? So as I mentioned, there's a Tribal Coastal Resilience Index that Louisiana Sea Grant and the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe are working on together. It's a pilot project right now. If you're not familiar with it, there's through actually multiple Sea Grant programs in the Gulf of Mexico led by Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant, is the Community Resilience Index. And that is a tool and a way for communities or towns, parishes, counties to kind of step through a set of questions under different categories to do a self-assessment of where they are with their strengths and weaknesses if something like a storm comes through. And from that, they can take that information and find tools to work on what they choose to work on and how they want to strengthen their individual community. So there's a general community version of it. There are a couple of different versions, actually, for example, for fishing ports or tourism, I think is another one as well. Louisiana Sea Grant tried it and with a tribal community, and it didn't work quite as well. There's some cultural differences that don't quite translate from a town or a parish or a county to a tribal community. So what they're working on together is to build a tribal focused version of it. And they've had a couple of sessions working with different community members. They've had sessions with external partners as well with information they can bring in. Grace actually was able to attend one of those. And they're working on trying to build a version of it that works better for tribal communities. So what we want to do is try and pull some of the NOAA information in, whether that might be a mapping tool that would be useful during taking the self-assessment itself, or stuff that might be useful information as they're trying to make their community stronger. And something else, as I mentioned, Sea Grant is academically focused as well. And they've been great with bringing in students and partners. And actually, Alyssa is on the call. Alyssa is also engaging with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe and Louisiana Sea Grant, looking at alternative oyster culture. It took me a second to remember that. Sorry about Alyssa. But basically, how can you culture oysters and, different areas, and how does that benefit the community as well? A couple of the other pictures here are, for example, in the center, something that the tribe has been doing a lot of is taking oyster shell and putting it out along the bayous to kind of shore up the bayou so it doesn't continue getting wider. It's especially important for culturally valuable areas and mounds and such. So what they're doing in the middle is looking at data about, how those are doing and what's growing on it. And, or do you have other animals, and are little oysters starting to grow on the shells that they put out? And basically, how is the system building around these? And it's doing pretty well, actually, which is really cool. And on the right is another picture of some students that were working on taking some cores out of the marsh to look at what's going on in the soil itself and how it's holding up. So with that, as I mentioned, this is kind of our pilot project, looking at a very small rural coastal tribal community, and how does NOAA do better with connecting with that community and maintaining a long-term relationship, and how do we take that experience and bring it to other communities in the area. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to introduce the Southeast and Southwest project as well. You're on mute, Brian. I do it all the time.
That's hilarious. You should have kept me going, and I would have been like, next slide. That's great. Very good. All right, thanks, Kristen. As mentioned before, the heat topic is extreme, and it's only going to get worse, unfortunately, as we continue to move forward in our changing climate. But because it's so significant and claims more lives, the number one killer, as I mentioned, weather and climate events, is heat. Two of the NOAA collaboration teams, dedicated their pilot to it. And just like water is likely, the next number one hazard, we focused on water impacts with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe. And also, we had the North Atlantic team focus on flooding as well. But heat really is an opportunity for us to do a lot of collaboration with folks outside of NOAA. In terms of, as it mentions here, increased real-time heat monitoring. We can't do that alone. So, I remember when I worked out in Lubbock, we worked with Texas Tech University to expand and create what's called the West Texas Mesonet. Some states have very impressive mesonets, and really what that means is a network of data collecting platforms, and they focus on the meteorological data, rainfall accumulation, things like that. Grace is on the line. She manages the network for the water and for getting oceanographic and weather information, and she'll be available to talk about that as well. But the heat risk is also another aspect. So it really takes outreach. It takes us as NOAA working with partners to engage with communities, to engage with people, to let them understand, what do they do? Not everyone knows what the call to actions are, or what do I do if it's going to be extremely hot out, and if heat stress is going to be a problem, or if we're looking at record high temperatures, what are they actually going to be doing? So again, that's something that we're looking at. I actually have two cats in the background that are about to argue with one another. So if you hear that, it's like clockwork, this time in the evening and also in the morning. There they go right there. But usually I separate them, but that's okay. In any case, the goal, as it says here, is really about resiliency. So building up people's capacity to understand what to do, when the heat comes their way. And on the next slide, talking a little bit more about why heat matters. And this is the slide, on the right-hand side that I had in my mind when I was talking about the heat-related fatalities. And if it's hard to see there, but to the left of the spike is heat. And you can see it talks about a 10-year average, a 30-year average, and then the weather fatalities, I believe it's in 2021. A little bit to the left, we're looking at tornadoes, we're looking at lightning, we're looking at hurricanes, and you can see you basically, if you were to add those three up, that is what produces, a little bit less than the fatalities that he produces. So again, very significant impact. It's why we're looking so deeply into it. It's why we're looking at, how can we better engage with communities, especially underserved communities, because historically, they don't receive the information as readily accessible as other people. And so, like I mentioned, putting on my National Weather Service hat, we're out there in our communities. I've got 15 counties that is in my service area across West Central and Southwest Florida. And we're out there meeting with them. We're at churches. We go to churches and we have outreach events. We go to schools and we go to other partners like Coast Guard for us or other NOAA. And we really try to get people to understand the hazards in that specific area. And on the next slide, I think Kristen's going to be diving more into those two pilot projects.
Yep. Thank you, Brian. So as Brian mentioned, the Southeastern Caribbean and the Western Regional Pilot Project really focused on heat and heat health. They worked in 4 different cities. That's Las Vegas, Phoenix, Charleston, South Carolina, and Miami, Florida. And they had 4 different phases to the project and have 4 different phases. This pilot project is ongoing as well. So the first step is to gather data through heat monitoring. That is with community partners. There's this little, you can kind of see it in the upper picture. It's this little tool on a tripod that takes information about, what the heat is actually looking like. And it also has an infrared camera picture on it. So you can see, like, for example, how hot a piece of metal playground equipment is in full sun and compare that to underneath a shade tree. They also hosted extreme heat tabletop exercises, and they're working on developing a set of recommendations and how to act on those recommendations. Similarly, partners are a big part of this pilot project. They had them ranging from the state and local government, health organizations, universities, and also they involved community-based and faith-based organizations. There were a bunch of different pieces in NOAA underneath there. We have a lot of acronyms in NOAA, so I'll just try to explain a couple of those. CCART is the Southeastern Caribbean Regional Team, so the counterpart for the team that Brian and myself work with. NOAA West, similarly a counterpart regional collaboration team. OAR is Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, or the heavy duty research branch of NOAA. They have the Climate Program Office. NESDIS is the satellites and data part of NOAA. And similarly, they look at taking that data and information and turning them into climate services and products and information that are useful for communities and other partners. Also involved with the weather forecast offices for the areas and national programs with the Weather Service, which is NWS. So similarly, some outcomes and next steps for this pilot project: data collection. That was very helpful for building relationships and getting local insights for what people are seeing and what people are feeling in their neighborhoods. Heat often is, you have a heat island in larger cities and places with more pavement than others. And a lot of times those areas also overlay with more of the frontline community type areas. As I mentioned, they worked on tabletop exercises, and that also helped with creating relationships and building momentum in the communities themselves for taking action afterwards and really understanding what's going on in their community and how they can try and mitigate some of the effects of heat. They're also writing up after action reports to those tabletop exercises, which is kind of a, what did we learn, what went well, what needs to be done in the future, and to identify additional interventions and things that can be done in future cases. Some next steps for the heat pilot is to host continued cross-location discussions. So again, they had 4 different areas around the country that they were looking at. They're working on developing a playbook for addressing heat health risk in communities and using the lessons learned that have been developed from this pilot project. So the playbook is something that they're hoping can be used in other communities to do similar work. They're also working on building upon heat pilot successes through existing NOAA and interagency programs. And I'll mention what NIHIS is in just a second. So that's a real quick overview of the heat pilot and some of what they're working on. And just real quickly, I know our other speaker was going to likely talk about Justice 40, so I wanted to mention a little bit about that and some of the things that NOAA is doing, particularly as related to climate and heat. So Justice 40, as a quick recap, federal government has made it a goal that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments should go to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. So I have a couple of pieces here that are covered by Justice 40 within NOAA. Covered means that it's applicable to it. So the first one I wanted to mention is the Climate Adaptation Partnerships CAP, or formerly known as the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment, or RISA program. The purpose for that is to build adaptive capacity and relationships that increase the knowledge, abilities, and confidence of decision makers and communities to adapt to climate change. So what they do is they take research and information and convert it into products and services that are applicably local at a more regional scale. So for example, there's a Southern Regional Climate Center based over in Texas that covers a good portion of the Western Gulf and a little bit inland as well. NIHIS, you saw that acronym. As I said, there's a lot of acronyms in NOAA. NIHIS is the National Integrated Heat Health Information System. They have a website called heat.gov. It is a massive resource for heat health information across many agencies. NIHIS is not just a NOAA thing. There are a number of federal agencies that are involved with it. One of the projects that they work on is Urban Heat Islands, which connects really closely with the Southeastern Caribbean and the West Pilot. Urban heat islands are where, as I mentioned, the urban areas, because of the pavement, can be 15 to 20 degrees warmer than rural areas that are nearby. And as I mentioned, those can also overlay pretty closely with some of the frontline communities. And one of the things that they're working on is mapping these urban heat islands. And that also connects with some of the heat research and the gathering information aspects of the pilot for the heat project. And they've been doing this since 2017. And every summer they work with different cities around the country. And what they do is they try and map the urban heat islands in order to provide information to the communities so that the communities can kind of think about what they might be able to do to mitigate some of the effects of that heat. And I just wanted to mention a couple things at a little bit of a broader level. I'm sure you've heard of the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's a good bit of money moving through many, many agencies in the federal government to work on this, and some upcoming NOAA funding out of that might be of interest. Just opened literally maybe on Tuesday is the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. That is $575 million that will be available for projects that build the resilience of coastal communities to extreme weather and other impacts of climate change, including sea level rise and drought. Just as a quick note, it's a pretty quick turnaround for the letters of intent, not the whole application, just the letters of intent. Those are due August 21st of this year. And there will be several more, especially climate-related funding opportunities to come through NOAA. And I also included the kind of the landing page for NOAA's Inflation Reduction Act information and funding opportunities as they come up. And NOAA is actually part of the Department of Commerce. So I wanted to mention a couple of other things that our fellow bureaus are doing within the Department of Commerce. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration has the Internet for All initiative, which is working on making high-speed internet affordable for all by funding planning, infrastructure, and adoption efforts that promote digital equity and inclusion around the country. So that's to try and bridge the digital gap between different parts of the country that may have really great internet connection and not so great internet connection. So try and level the playing field there. And our other fellow bureau, the Economic Development Administration, is working on the Good Jobs Challenge. That one's focused on workforce development as a key to accelerating local economic growth and rebuilding regional economies so they are more resilient to future challenges, and also to provide good job opportunities for American workers towards economic mobility and security. So those were just a couple of things that I wanted to mention at the broader level in case it was of interest to the audience today. And with that, we're ready to turn it over for conversations and questions. Thank you so much.
Kristen and Brian, thank y'all. That was perfect. And we really appreciate your valuable time tonight. We have at least two of our Gulf partners. I've already mentioned Jan in Florida, and I see we have Morris from Mississippi. But let me open it up both to our partners and to our audience. Please feel free to unmute, come on camera if you wish. And you can also, of course, type your questions in the chat if you're unable to do it.
Hi, I'm working in Florida, Brian, in an area where you are. And I just wanted to find out, and I see that so Luana Gelzer is on here and Constance Brown are on here, and they're working in Central Florida. And one of the things we're working on is an EPA enhanced air quality monitoring program where we're going to be doing air quality monitoring. And when I was listening to this, I was wondering if it is, I mean, I know it's possible with the monitors that we're getting to get a little weather, thing. It's the AeroQual AQS monitors that we're looking at. They have a little weather station on them. And so I saw the work about the urban heat island effect. And I'm wondering if there's a way that we can connect with some resources to determine if that is something that we could connect with in some way, that we would be able to measure that heat and connect with whoever's doing that kind of work.
I mean, I know we, with the National Weather Service, we work with the county and also the state EPA, if you will. And our main connection with them, at least on the Weather Service side, is when it becomes like air quality alerts. And so the county, say, for example, Hillsborough County, where I am, they'll send us a notice on a particular day, and it'll be about ozone action day, maybe a high level of ozone or pollution. And they'll use us as the National Weather Service as a dissemination vehicle, so that we'll be able to amplify the message to the public. As far as, are you thinking like you already have sensors?
Yeah, quickly here. This is Gary Harris. I've worked with NOAA in the past extensively. Matter of fact, helped to kick off the Weather Ready Nation program on the National Weather Service side, and was also a National Weather Service partner as well. Matter of fact, coming out of that initiative, we now have something called building a weather.
Oh,
Uh-oh.
just lost him. I think, Kyle, maybe if we speak too long, we automatically get thrown off the conversation. That's awesome. Oh, that's great.
I'm
Chrissy,
sorry,
there's
could you check for Jan? She's trying to rejoin.
Okay. I will certainly admit her as soon as she shows up in the waiting list.
Well, since it's being recorded, I could just finish that. We do work with state partners on the air quality messaging, really just to send the information out over NOAA Weather Radio and also through our dissemination system. As far as adding weather instrumentation on existing air quality platforms, the National Weather Service, we don't do that currently, but that could be a really good opportunity for the IRA funding opportunity that Kristen mentioned, where if there was a large enough effort and someone wanted to submit a proposal or a letter of intent to do that, that's exactly the type of thing that they're looking for these funding opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Sorry, I just everything blipped off. I couldn't.
Yeah, we are not sure what happened.
Well, let's go back to the question Jan asked, because I'm very concerned when you mentioned the EPA, state, and local levels. The reason why we're doing these air monitoring is because these machinery, the monitors are not even near the communities that are suffering at an all-time high. I mean, they're miles away, so no data means you don't have any proof anything is happening. So because we're talking about Justice 40 funding, we're talking about BIPOC community and underserved communities. That's something I really want Jan and I to look at, because we're the first to lose power and the last to receive information. And we're tired of being at the mercy of local government sometime. We are capable of disseminating information within our community. I actually have one of the only permanent resilient hubs in Orange County. So we're distributing site for food and charging station for batteries. That was done by the community. That was not funded by the state or anybody else. So what I'm trying to say is, and we're going to talk about equity, our communities have been lacking for too many years because of lack of equity. So we would like to see if there's a possibility to bridge that gap, that conversation continues, because we have been on that marginalized. That's why you say underserved communities. And the proximity to where we're located is literally downtown Orlando. We're in the urban community, and yet we're still the last to get information. It's always disseminated through media. But if you don't have power or you don't have another source, you don't know what's going on.
That's an excellent point, Luana. And I just put a link because as you were speaking, it made me think of a past effort. I put the link in the chat with EPA.gov. The National Weather Service had worked up in Baltimore, Maryland. Our previous Weather Service director, Louis Uccellini, would really discuss this a lot on the disproportionate impacts of heat on the communities in Baltimore. And like you said, if there wasn't data in the communities that were most heavily impacted, then what's the impact? You know, so it was very disproportionate. But no, definitely read that link over there. But yeah, there was a case study in Baltimore where they did what you're saying, because they were then, I think, if I remember correctly, they were then having an effort to then even make sure that they painted the roofs white, so it would then be somewhat cooler versus, you know, like my house, you know, black roof and everything like that with the asphalt. So they were trying to mitigate the impacts in the communities that were mostly concrete, that were mostly paved. They had very few trees, and that area was a notorious heat island. So I'm glad you brought that up, because yeah, that was Baltimore, Maryland was a case study for that effort. And the EPA up there may have some strategies on what they did to help communities across the country.
Thank you. We will, as a group, we'll follow up on that.
Yes, thank you very much. Because we know when you were talking about heat is the #1 cause of death. I mean, we have seniors, we're in Florida, and it's cool today, it's 76 now, but it was 90 something. And you still got community housing with no central air, maybe have a fan, hopefully a window unit, and you know that's not working. And when our seniors are on fixed income, they're not, and that's my concern. My seniors, especially.
Yeah. Just quickly here, Gary Harris. I was on a panel yesterday with the National Academy of Sciences and such. And it was a 2-day panel which focused on problems and solutions around heat and the heat island effect and extreme heat and such. And the guy on my panel, I thought his first name was Matt. I can't remember his last name, but he was from NOAA, and he led the integrated effort around agencies for extreme heat, such. So anyway, it was 2 days, and we came up with a bunch of solutions and et cetera. And those papers should be out shortly.
Well, thank you. And I really thought that was really wonderful. Some of the instrumentation that you were getting to the folks in the heat island areas. You know, it's one thing to be able to measure the temperature, and it's another to have the visual of that, you know, infrared. Really, sometimes the visuals are so powerful, and it's a way of doing some storytelling. Your NOAA story maps and things have been really helpful. You know, in the areas where we were doing frontline work with people with flooding, just having the tide tables has been a lifesaver for them to be able to organize their lives around, what to expect in terms of sea level rise on top of a storm surge, on top of whatever is a regular tide schedule. So just thanking you for that, because it's just been it can be a lifeline for people that are really struggling to make sure in Florida, if you don't have comprehensive insurance on your motor vehicle and it floods and your vehicle is a total loss, your insurance doesn't cover it, and many people don't know that. And so just being able to know where alternate parking is and when they should be seeking that alternate parking is really important financially to people. So thank you for that.
I wanted to bring Grace. Grace, are you able to come on camera? Grace works with us in the NOAA Gulf team as well, and she manages the what's called co-ops, the Center for Oceanographic. I'm going to butcher that. Operational products and services, so co-ops. And so she with National Ocean Service, and she manages like what you mentioned earlier of the kind of the coastal network. And Grace, how would you like to describe that, and even up along the East Coast as well?
Yeah, so I'm with co-ops. We just say the Tides and Currents Office of NOAA. It's a lot easier that way. So I'm in outside of Pensacola, Florida, and I oversee the operations and maintenance of all our tide gauges and current meters, and some of those stations have met as well. And my region stretches from South Padre Island, Texas, all the way over to Key West. So I'm I oversee the field team and if you have any questions about those stations, I'm happy to answer them, but I'm also kind of a liaison for co-ops in the Gulf of Mexico. So if you need anything beyond that, or stations in other regions, or I'm happy to facilitate.
Do you cover the Panama City area?
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you for that. We have a team in Panama City. I mean, we've been working with them since Hurricane Michael.
Okay.
But some of just the, some of the tools that you're showing, we try to walk them through to everybody, like the FEMA apps, of course, everybody on Code Red and everything. But for people to really understand the tides and the currents, and to really understand also in the hurricanes, if there's been a sewage, if there's been a, raw sewage dump, where has that occurred? And then trying to understand what it's going to impact, where it's going to move. So I'm glad to know you're there in Pensacola, and I can kind of jot down your name and office. So you never know when you might get a call. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. No problem.
I just put the link in the chat too for the Grace's or co-ops, Tides and Currents, and you can click a state and see the data, and that's very helpful. We use it all the time at my office as well.
Yes, and Brian and Kristen have graciously said that we can share their slides. So once we edit and upload the video to our YouTube channel, put the link to the slides in the description and let everybody know. I know we're a few minutes over, and want to honor everybody's time, but really excited about this conversation and future conversations, and really want to thank everyone choosing to be here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Any burning questions before we give folks their evening back? They can't wait.
I just want to say thank you for the tools that you've developed that can be used, and for the best practices that you guys put out, that so we can look to see what's been done. And thank you for these resources that are related to these funding sources that are coming out. There's a lot, and it can be kind of overwhelming, and to be given specifics is very helpful.
Amen and amen.
Yeah.
Cheers and thanks.
Here.
Everybody.
Thank you for
Later.
the resources.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great learning more about you guys. Bye-bye.
So much.